Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our ambassadors-sponsored series, the Master Series. The introductions will be made this evening by our TMA Employee of the Year, Scott Boberg. So do give him a round of applause. But first of all, I want to welcome all those of you who have been out to what has been amusingly called Warbler Stock, which is Ohio's wonderful birding festival. A number of years ago, Bob Bell, so distinguished with the Toledo Symphony for so long, said to me after a concert here in the Peristyle in early 2011, would you like to go out birding tomorrow morning? And I said, oh, that'd be great. He said, okay, I'll pick you up at 5. And I'd never done that before. But when I went there, I realized that I was witnessing tens of thousands of binocular-toting, camera-holding, smiling, wondrous birders. And it's only got bigger and bigger since then. I think last year they said that 37 species of warblers were out there on McGee Marsh, and the town of Oak Harbor completely taken over as it is. The males, of course, of the birding population in their very, very wonderful plumage, and the females trying not to look too impressed. And that whole 2,000-acre wetland is remarkable, and it's become one of the biggest festivals of its kind, of course, called the biggest week in American birding. And I'm thrilled that Paula Reich, who among many other duties here at the museum, took on a request by me a few years ago, so that every second year, and this is now the third, we have had an exhibition related to birding here at the Toledo Museum of Art, coinciding with the biggest week in American birding. And the first one, we raided our collection to find all the birds in the museum and had a little trail where you could go all around the museum trying to find all the birds in all the works of art. And then we started to collect works of art, which informed the great tradition of the handbook, the birding handbook. And we particularly acquired work by Peterson and got to know Kimberly and Ken Kaufman very well over this period of time. And so this whole biggest week in American birding, to me, is all about the keenness of close looking, of visual literacy, of the similarities and the differences between some of the most extraordinary creatures on our planet. So I'm delighted that we're here this evening to have our first speaker whose exhibition is a one-man exhibition here. So we've gone from collective exhibitions to a one-person exhibition. But to introduce that, as I said, please make Scott Boberg, our Manager of Programs, very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce Fred Tomaselli and this program, and I want to also extend my thanks to the Toledo Museum of Art ambassadors for making the Master Series possible. So if you don't mind, give them another round of applause. They could really, they make extraordinary things happen here at the museum. I want to begin with just a couple of housekeeping items. I have my cell phone out, not because I'm expecting a call, but as a reminder to myself to turn my phone to silent. So please take a moment to do that. If you want to take pictures, just do so without a flash. So phone is off, that's good. Also, those of you who may want to ask questions of Fred at the end of this presentation, we will have microphones at the end of either aisle. So once Fred is done with his presentation and you'd like to ask a question, we just ask that you come to one of the microphones and we'll alternate back and forth. The program should last about an hour altogether. A couple of items that I want to bring to your attention because you're here at the Toledo Museum of Art on a fine Thursday evening. And one of those is that you have time after the show to meet and speak with Fred at a book signing that will follow immediately in Libby Court. There will not only be several books to sign, but there's an extraordinary puzzle which maybe you've seen the picture of, that you could purchase. I think Fred will sign the puzzle as well. There's a tea towel, there's coasters, but these are objects that the museum has produced with Fred and with Third Drawer Down Studio. So take a look at those objects as well, but come up and say hello to Fred, who will be doing a book signing starting a little after 7 o'clock. Also, if you have time, the whole reason that Fred is here was because of this extraordinary exhibition called Keep Looking, Fred Tomaselli's Birds. So please go to our Gallery 6. Any of our security officers or staff would be more than happy to direct you to this gallery. And it's a relatively small exhibition in terms of square footage, but there are enormous works, small works, and these are works that you will literally get lost in, and it's something that Fred intends you to do in his work. I also mentioned that tonight, across the street in our glass salon, please stop by for our Glass Under Jazz series with the Art Tatum Jazz Society. That concert is tonight from 7:30 to 9:30, so if you'd like to hear some great music in Art Tatum's hometown, please pop across the street. Just a couple of the programs related to Fred Tomaselli's exhibition I just want to mention. Brian referred to Paula Reich, the curator of this exhibition, and I just want to mention that she will be giving a birding tour, but it's in the gallery. It's called Avian Art, Birding in the Gallery, so she will be taking the group next Thursday, the 19th at 7 p.m. on a birding tour in search of 2- and 3-dimensional birds outside of Fred's exhibition, although you'll probably end up there as well. And then 2 weeks from tonight, on May 26th, the great Toledo area, Detroit area poet Terry Blackhawk. She has a fantastic name, but she also is a birder, and she will be reading poetry at 7 p.m. 2 weeks from tonight out in our magnificent museum grounds. And before I introduce Fred, I just want to take a moment to mention that in our audience tonight is James Cohan. James, where are you? Raise your hand. See his hand raising. I'd like to have you all give this Toledo native a great round of applause because he is Fred Tomaselli's dealer through the very distinguished James Cohan Gallery in New York and Shanghai, and he's here with his wife, Jane. So please give them a warm Toledo welcome back. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about Fred's work because Fred is here to really dive into where his work started, and you'll get a beautiful and detailed look at his work. But I mentioned earlier a quote from Fred, "I want to get lost in the work." And what's amazing is you see his artwork from a distance, and it's beautiful. And you get up closer, it's beautiful. And then you have this oh my gosh moment when you realize that there's more to it. You literally fall into a bird beak that is made up of dozens of bird beaks or of feathers that are really flowers. And so you just lose yourself in these extraordinary works of art. He has had solo exhibitions all over the country. I had the pleasure of working with him at the Aspen Art Museum for a mid-career survey about 5 years ago. And I want to mention, some of you don't know, but he actually has a fairly distinguished relationship with music. Not only is he friends with the members of the band They Might Be Giants, but he's done album covers for Laura Cantrell, her third album, Humming by the Flowered Vine. He did the cover for the Magnetic Fields album I. He's also worked with Wilco, Fish, and Elysian Fields. He's a man of many interests, not the least of which is music, but certainly birding. So please give a very warm and rousing Toledo welcome to Fred Tomaselli.
Thank you all for coming. Let's see here. I hope that I'm not going to disappoint too many people here when I say that although I love birds and I've used a lot of birds in my work, and all the work in the show is of birds, a lot of my work it doesn't have anything to do with birds at all. But it all has something to do with perception and how one's perception is modified in various sort of cultural ways, and how I've been affected by that, and how it's affected society. So I actually abandoned painting because of the burden of history in the early 80s. I just didn't, with all these great works of art and all these great paintings out in the world, I felt really, I just felt like it was an impossible task to kind of meet that history and try to add something else. And in Los Angeles, where I'm from, there was a lot of new media and performative art, and it seemed like there was a space within that, within this sort of work of realm of installation art, where I could possibly make some meaningful contribution. And I was really excited about a lot of the work I was seeing in and around that time. So my initial works were not inspired by birds, but by theme parks and mall culture, and the way they kind of modified my reality. I should say that, like, basically, I grew up in Orange County, really close to Disneyland, so every night Tinkerbell would fly around on the night sky amid the fireworks, and I thought that was normal. And what I didn't think was normal was when I went on a hike, when I was a teenager, to like smoke pot with my friends, and we discovered a waterfall, and I was looking for the pump and conduit that was running it. And so for me, the real was stranger than the unreal. And that dislocation between reality and sort of artificial constructions of reality, that friction became an inspiration to some of my work. So I'm going to start kind of like at the beginning, and then hopefully we'll have enough time. Oh, I should set my stopwatch here so I don't go over. So anyway, so I thought I would start at the very beginning to sort of give you an idea of where I came from, how I found my way back to painting, and so this is a work from 1984 called Current Theory, and this is an experiment to see if this works. Oh, it does. And all it was a bunch of styrofoam cups tethered to the floor with little threads blowing in the wake of these 3 fans. And this is of a recent installation that I did at James Cohen, where we revisited my older work, which very few people know about, but they do now. And basically, I was thinking about, like, taking the flotsam and jetsam, the garbage that was floating on the sea, and making a sea. I wanted it to also be. I also wanted it to be very artificial. I wanted it to be, but I also wanted it to be very meditative. And I wanted to take these containers that once had water in them and turn them into water. And so, but it also had a lot to do with nature itself and with the mechanics and physics of nature. So I did a whole lot of stuff. I'm not going to show, hardly even a bit of it. But this is one of the first pieces I made after moving to New York. And I moved to Williamsburg. It was really a dicey neighborhood in 1985. And I was wondering, like, why is everybody, like, so mean and they're all like heroin addicts or crackheads? And I thought, well, maybe it's because they can't see the night sky. So I decided to make this piece called Cubic Sky. And what it was, this piece, by the way, is going to Mass MoCA. The minute I come back from here, I install it over there, and it'll be up for a year. So if you guys get to Massachusetts, you can see it. But what it is I took a map of the heavens, which is circular, sort of visually stretched it into a square, gridded up the square into 30 units, and then folded those units onto themselves, thereby containerizing the infinite. Every star that I could find in the northern hemisphere is depicted. And I guess at the time I was thinking that looking up into the heavens was man's oldest way of turning his back to the world. And I was very interested in this idea of, like, both delivering an escapist experience, but also commenting on that experience, because that experience, I think, seemed to be not just responsible for the shape I was in as a person, but it was also seemed to be maybe responsible for the shape we were in as a culture. I mean, at that time, Ronald Reagan had become president, and whatever you think about him, it was an actor. He was an actor who ascended into this role, and that kind of blew my mind. And with the current political situation, stuff keeps happening, you know. And so anyway, this is a work I made called The Sweet Aroma of Revolution. And from the front, basically the logo you see on this front here is the Symbionese Liberation Army logo, the logo for the revolutionary cell that kidnapped Patty Hearst, was burned to death by the LAPD. It was a national spectacle. But if you look at it from the side, it's a functioning bong. And so you can, so you can like smoke the painting. And so a bong, for those of you who don't know, is a device to consume marijuana. So anyway, I was thinking about this whole notion of like revolutionary politics, and this sort of, it in effect was also another escapist kind of ideology. Like I was thinking about it both from the left and the right, and thinking about how all of this sort of was about almost an autoimmune response to a condition within the culture. So, and then this is a work called Comforter, and what I did was I lovingly sewed all these matchbook covers that were available in New York at the time, that were either sex hotline matchbook covers or get-rich-quick matchbook covers. And I sort of thought of this sort of lonely dude slipping himself into, and this is for dudes, and slipping himself into this comforter, and having the kind of the phone system of New York sort of becoming part of his neurobiological network, and that he was connected to all these notions of power, and then they invented the internet. So that was in well, they'd already invented the internet. I made that in, I think, 1988. So I think the last piece I'm going to show you, now the work is, it's all very self-consciously dealing with phenomenon while delivering a secondary phenomenon, but it's all sort of about traveling. It's all about like art that takes you from one place to another. And in this work here, this is a work I did that I designed in 1996. No, 1990, I'm sorry. I completed it in 1996. It was a public art project for the New York's Hall of Science. And I decided I wanted to design the handrails for the second floor rotunda. And what I did was I found, I got a pointer. What I did was I found out where the Science Museum was going to be, which is that red dot. And what I did was I plotted a 10-kilometer radius using that dot as a fulcrum point through New York City. And it goes through the Bronx, Long Island Sound, a little bit of Nassau County, Queens, Brooklyn, across the East River, Manhattan, and back to the Bronx. Then what I did was I found north, and I plotted 5-degree increments along the circumference of this circle, 72 points in all. And then sort of like John Cage, or sort of using chance operatives, I went to each site and photographed whatever was there, and then inserted the photographs into the peepholes that are mounted inside this rotunda. And inside these peepholes are these backlit slides of places that either are or were there exactly 10 kilometers away in a straight line from the viewer. And so therefore it kind of maybe extends the museum out into space, or extends the space outside the museum back into itself. And so I kind of used Walker Evans as a sort of, or Dan Graham as a sort of role model. And I took these very flat-footed photographs of whatever was there, and I was very strict about it. So anyway, that's just, I guess that's the only photo, sorry. So it's just a pool in Queens. But anyway, so the whole time I was doing all of this, I was a Sunday painter. Like, okay, I abandoned painting, but I was still doing these little plein air watercolors. They were very conservative. They were just about looking and seeing and depicting. And I didn't really consider them art, but I did consider them a kind of pleasure. And it also was a way for me to kind of keep my hand in the game about trying to describe what I was seeing. And you know, drawing from nature and drawing from life really is about seeing. You know, you really have to, like, you can't deal with things stereotypically. You have to really look at them. And I find that, like, there's nothing I remember in more detail than the things that I've drawn from life. And but these drawings, you know, sort of started going off in these places. And I remember starting, like, I was chopping cabbages and then just drawing whatever the kind of psychedelic patterns that you see in red cabbages and turning those things into abstractions. And I slowly started making things that I kind of thought maybe they were art. So this is an early work from 1990. This is called Every Rock Band I Can Remember Seeing. And it is a sort of a constellation, sort of like, yeah, and maybe you could see it as maybe two sides of the lobes of the mind, of the brain. And I was just trying to kind of posit myself in this sort of like hedonistic world that I came out of. I mean, you know, maybe a lot of artists have some guilt about the fact that we are engaged in ultimately somewhat narcissistic endeavors while the world around us falls apart. And I was sort of trying to address that in this work. And, but also, this then led to another work, which I unfortunately don't have with me, called Every Rock Band I Can Remember Seeing and Every Vertebrate in North America That's Become Extinct Since 1492. So it was sort of about seeing and not seeing, nature and culture, the eventual extinction of all these things. And it does posit my kind of hedonistic relationship to the world, you know, in this drawing. So that then in turn led to these constellation drawings I did, where they were where I was, and this is where I'm really thinking, oh yeah, this is art now, you know, and where I would ask the sitter to give me their birth date and their drug history, every drug they can remember taking. And then what I ended up doing was I'd find the constellation that associated with their birth date vis-a-vis astrology, and create these little photograms, which is where I'd put pills and sugar on photographic paper, expose it to light, and develop it. And then I would relabel the stars with their chemical history. So they were these chemical celestial portraits, these portraits of inner space and outer space. And these are the 12 houses of the zodiac, my 12 friends. And as you can maybe, and it sort of kind of maybe relates back to Cubic Sky, in that I'm still chopping up the universe, still chopping up the heavens, still containerizing them, but then putting in this other kind of information. So, so then I started thinking, like, you know, I traded some of these works to other friends of mine who had paintings, and I was living with paintings, and I was like thinking about it, and I was, you know, seeing how paintings changed through the day. I hadn't really lived with art like that before. And it really started getting me to thinking about, like, what do pictures mean? And I started thinking about this sort of, you know, this sort of pre-modernist ideal of paintings as windows to other realities, or this idea that you can, like, that they become transportation vehicles to take you to other dimensions. And then I started thinking about the rhetoric around that sort of intersects with the sublime and the transcendent. And I started thinking, man, that sounds a lot like what hippies say about psychedelic drugs. And you know, and I'd taken a lot of psychedelic drugs, and I started thinking, like, that kind of uncanny, like, rhetorical resemblance. I started thinking, like, well, you know, maybe and so I started making these pictures where I actually inserted real pharmaceuticals in these just sort of very, you know, monochromatic plywood panels. This is a piece, the first piece I did, it's called Big as Me. And it's sort of an homage to the artist Bruce Nauman, who made art that came out of his body and out of the dimensions of his body. And it's a spinal cord made out of, I don't know if I have a detail here. I don't, but whatever. It's a spinal cord made out of acetaminophen or Tylenol, aspirin, and I think a little bit of saccharin. So it's as big as me. And I was thinking about this idea of like rearranging the use value of the objects. So instead of like maybe coursing through your bloodstream to alter consciousness, they course through your eyeballs. So it's a different route to modifying your perception. And from there on in, I started, I guess, slowly and tentatively, utilizing the language of geometric abstraction. I slowly started like inching towards being a painter. This is a work called 13,000, and it's about 13,000 aspirins stacked up on their edge. I routed channels. I should say that I was a woodworker. I was an auto mechanic. I did electrical systems. I was a handyman to a slumlord. I had a lot of like skill sets that I was able to like bring into the studios that were outside of painting. So I just utilized all these sort of crafts. And one of them was just like, because of my background in joinery and marquetry, I was able to like basically make these sort of marquetry channels to then insert the pills. And I was also a surfboard maker. So in the garages of Southern California. So I started utilizing surfboard resin to encase this water-soluble ephemeral material, thereby preserving it to be infinitely consumed by various individual eyes over and over again until they fall apart. So anyway, so then I started thinking like I really need, I'm using all these like over-the-counter pharmaceuticals. I think I need something maybe a little bit more subcultural, because whether it's an aspirin or a hit of acid, it seemed to me it was all about the same thing. If you have a headache and your headache goes away after taking aspirin, then your reality's been modified. And again, art is about the modification of reality. So I started inserting pot into my work, hemp leaves, if you will. This is an early work called X Will Fade. In this work here, I knew that the leaves would shift to gold over time due to their exposure to ultraviolet light. So I painted all the leaves about the same color that they were, except for the X, which sort of faded into a pattern many years later. This is a later photograph of the work. But the thing about using leaves in my work, or pot in my work, was that it opened me up to the shape of nature. Someplace, I had been like hiking and surfing and, playing out in the hills and mountains and the desert and the sea close to my house all my life. There wasn't a lot of culture. That was what you had to do in order to entertain yourself. And living in the city, kind of devoid of nature, I realized that, that was something that was super important to me. So I started, that allowed the shape of nature to get into the work. And as you'll see, it kind of grew and grew and became a bigger and bigger part of the work. This is a work called If I Could See Your Voice. And this is one of the first works where I sort of started floating resin, acrylic paint between layers of resin, thereby kind of creating a slight vestigial, almost like a kind of a relief. You see like shadow play and dimensionality when you look at that work. But I was specifically interested in this idea of like the measurement of sound and of synesthesia, and this idea of like Richter scales and oscilloscopes and anything that kind of like the visual manifestation of the aural and the confusion thereof. And then shortly thereafter that, I made this piece, which I was so embarrassed about because it seemed so ridiculously decorative. And I hid it for a while, but this is a piece called Superplant. And what it is a plant that I made out of 6 psychoactive substances that hybridized together. And let's see if I can get the pointer to work. So you have tobacco leaves, And then you have morning glory seeds, which contain an indole related to LSD. You have, this is ephedra, which is the basis of ephedrine, which can then be cooked down into methamphetamine, coffee beans, psilocybin mushrooms, and cannabis. And the reason I call it superplant is if it ever existed, it would rule the world. And I added the blue flowers because it needed it, you know. And I guess I was a little like, you know, artists are supposed to, like, you know, it's about truth and be tough and all that stuff. And it seemed like a little soft, but, you know, I was very interested in this. I was also very fascinated and have a long-going fascination with Rajasthani miniatures and with American folk art. And I think in both, I think like the foliage that one sees in Rajasthani miniatures out of India, and maybe the tree of life quilts that one sees, say, in Shaker bedspreads, they were sort of commingling onto this piece. So anyway, I eventually showed it, and that opened up the notions of the decorative into the work. And so this work here, this one here is called Utah Saint. And this is one of the first works where, it's one of the first works where it's a nervous system made out of ephedra that I collected out in the Mojave Desert, close to where I had grown up. The reason I call it Utah Saint is that the Mormons, it's also known as Mormon tea, because the Mormons weren't allowed to drink caffeine, but Joseph Smith forgot that there was he didn't know that there was ephedrine-laced desert plants growing all around Salt Lake City. So all the Mormons would drink that to get, you know, up in the morning. And I had some Mormon relatives, so I don't know. I thought it was, and I'm really fascinated by them. So, but in this work here, one of the things that's happening here is I'm starting to insert photo collage that's commingling with paint and real things. So that mixture of the real, the photographic, and the painterly, that slipperiness also seemed to maybe kind of advance this idea of the slipperiness of reality. So a lot of the work at that time was also, there was also a lot of performative works that were going on. I'd gone upstate New York for the summer, and I was, we were next to a creek. It was really beautiful. There were like birds and, you know, little deer running around and everything. And as I had this barn I worked in, and when I was working out there, you know, I have to have pretty pristine conditions to utilize the resin. And there were so many bugs, and they would come off the river every night, or the creek every night, and then invade my studio and die and get stuck in the resin, and they were messing everything up. So I said, well, okay, if you can't beat them, join them. So what I did was I hauled out these two, what were painted yellow panels, out into the meadow next to the house, aimed two big giant lights at the piece, and then sort of summoning the bugs off the river and into a swirl around the work. And when they reached their apex, I poured the resin out, and they all stuck and died in random formations, thousands of them. It almost became a portrait of the atmosphere, or you know, it's definitely a collision between nature and technology. And then what I did was I then cut black into it, and then built a kind of a narrative landscape out of it. In this case, I kind of created this out of collage material and paint. I kind of created this sort of cadaverous form, where in this work, I inverted the narrative so that the bugs are now hatching out of this guy and flowing off into the night sky. And this notion of hybridity, of hybrid creatures, like in Superplant, is apparent with, like, some of the bugs are made out of, there's some real bugs, there's bugs with like leaf wings, there's completely painted bugs. There's like bugs made with pills, and anyway, I think you get the idea. So, but this notion of hybridity, this idea of a hybrid, you know, as paintings as a sort of a hybrid arena, you know, for me was really appropriate because I've been so, you know, influenced by both deep, you know, by both like, Asian art, like I said, the Rajasthani miniatures, but also Persian miniatures and Tibetan tankas. But I was equally influenced by the 20th century modernists and by conceptual art, and specifically the work of Bruce Nauman, Chris Burden, and James Turrell, and the light and space artists. So I had a lot of these artists or influences might even be considered enemies of one another. I mean, I certainly in Los Angeles, the conceptualists, didn't really like the light and space people, and they were having all these feuds all the time. And I liked it all. I thought everything had, some validity to me. But I didn't. I was a kid. I didn't have any skin in the game. So anyway, this is another performative work called Dermal Delivery, or How I Quit Smoking. This is about 6.5 by 9 feet. And what it is was it was the first time I tried to quit smoking, and I was wearing nicotine patches, and every day I would take the nicotine patch, and I had I painted this as sort of like a flesh tone paint job, and every day I'd take my nicotine patch off and stick it on a grid on this piece, and then basically go crazy. But then what eventually happened was I started adding like little squares of skin that I cut out of magazines, and Band-Aids, and nitroglycerin patches, and kind of anything that conjured up the notion of skin, and also skin tones. I painted skin tones, squares. So anyway, so that's called Dermal Delivery, or How I Quit Smoking. So anyway, so again, I'm doing all this stuff. I'm really back into nature. Nature is sort of part of my work. I'm part of my work, I go out to. I really wanted to make landscapes, but like I had as a Sunday painter. I was always really enamored to the work of like Bierstadt, Thomas Cole, the Hudson River School, and their whole notion of the sublime, But by the time I inherited that, it become kind of airbrushed like van art, or something, and in the '70s, and I guess when I saw landscape, I saw it through a scrim of other kinds of information, of geopolitical information, of like lands conquered, people who had had genocide committed against them, watersheds, it was all kinds of like extra kind of information. I wanted to get this sort of other scrim of information. So I started making these landscapes. This is a piece called Ocotillo Nocturne. This, for me, it was also this other. I played a little game with this one where I depicted every succulent that was part of the southwestern ecosystem. So there's barrel cactuses, ocotillos, Joshua trees, you name it. And then I put this scrim of arabesque information in the form of pills and paint and leaves. And then that turned into, I'll just quickly, let me see, okay, so far. This is a piece called Circles. This is Blue Circles. So I was just sort of setting up, sort of like creating these landscapes, painting them all from photographs that I'd taken from places I'd been that I really loved. Like this is from Vermont, and like say, here's another piece. This is called Double Landscape. And anyway, I was inserting like paintings that I'd done after photographs. And so all that painterly skill that had atrophied while I was making installations is finally getting to come out. I get to do all the stuff. I can paint like abstract. I can like paint realistically. I can do everything I want. So this work here, Double Landscape, the little scene in the Tondo is a little painting I did of the Pecos Forest in New Mexico, a place I really like. And then the surrounding information is based on the map of the same area, of topographical maps. And it's dotted with saccharin, little saccharin tablets. So I get to like, you know, like, if I guess I was thinking like, now that I'm dealing with this idea of artist transportation, I want to go to places I want to go that I love. So that's sort of how that got started. So anyway, I thought I would tell you a little bit about how I make my things, the resin works at least. Okay, this is my garden in Brooklyn, or it's just you know, I grow a lot of different kinds of plants, and I kind of, let me see. This is Datura, for instance. I took the seed pod from right around where Georgia O'Keeffe lives in Abiquiu, New Mexico, brought him home to my backyard in Brooklyn, and I've been growing these Datura ever since. Georgia O'Keeffe really did some magnificent paintings of Datura. It's also a pan-global hallucinogen that will make you, but it will bring the principalities of darkness into you and give you a horrific trip. So I've never taken it, but I like having magic plants around. I just like feeling their power. So what I do is I press all these leaves. I grow these plants. They're really, I think they're beautiful. I press them like a 19th century, you know, dandy botanist, and then I insert them in my work. But I also like then cut out, you know, images from seed catalogs and you know, from various kinds of magazines and field guides. And what I do is we'll cut them out, we'll run them through a printer scanner, we'll reprint them into archival paper with archival ink, recut them out, put them on sticky paper, and then they can be used by me intuitively in the studio. I just sort of tear them off, and I can place them. I work on the floor, and oh, and here's my drug stash, and everything's a sort, you know, kind of like you know, assorted to genus, species, size, color. You know, I have had to create these taxonomies within my studio for my practice. There's lots of file cabinets full of a lot of stuff. I have file cabinets full of bugs and all kinds of stuff. And so I get all this stuff together, and then I work on the floor arranging things, and I have like a bridge that I can, sometimes I have to work with multiple panels for some of the larger pieces. And I can, you know, I work on like a camp pad, usually on my stomach or on my knees. And then I often have to get up on ladders to look down, and then I glue it all together, and then I get it up on the wall. And then eventually I make more paint. I put a lot of resin on there. I paint between layers. I sand it. Then I wax it, and then it's done. Like this is a piece called Gravity's Rainbow. It's in the collection of the Whitney Museum. It's 8 by 20 feet, and it weighs about 1,200 pounds. And so there you go. And you know, there's a detail of it. I should say that a lot of this stuff is like, I make a kind of like, this is a work, oh, I should go back here. This is a work that was really inspired by the artist Sol LeWitt, who I know is the artist who's responsible for the outside murals of this wonderful auditorium that I'm in. And he's been an extreme influence on me. And, you know, and he talked about like how like in conceptual art, like the mind was the machine that created the art, and then it was merely a matter of executing it in his famous essay, Sentences on Conceptualism. And he published an Art Forum in 1965. And so I started thinking about like, you know, I started to just set up, you know, kind of a system and let the system sort of run itself. And in this case, what I did was I took an 18-foot long, I took a pull chain, it was about 18 feet long, and I draped it from the very top and pinned it to, and it would make catenaries, the sort of arcs that happen, you know, the gravitational arcs that happen between 2 points. And then I would trace them and then move the chain and keep tracing them, and then get the bottom part of the information that was all like collage, and then pour resin, and then recut in, retrace in more, and started building this piece. very intuitively, but also utilizing, but sort of hanging ornament on a system that I'd already designed or devised. So, and then, so anyway, there you go. Much of this is paint, but there are, real objects again. And I should also say, like those hands there, those actually come out of my thinking about the severed heads that one sees in Tibetan thangkas and the black thangkas, where one is supposed to conquer their fear of death. And I just sort of took that and just sort of brought it in a little bit. And so that's how I sort of referenced it. This is a similar piece. It was just the same thing, but two sides sort of flipped up to the middle and turned into a symmetrical abstraction. This is called Echo, Wow, and Flutter. And it kind of reminded me a little bit, again, of going back to the synesthesia work, of this idea of the embodiment, the visual embodiment of sound. So, and in this case, in this one here, I got to add like some of the fire that one sees in Chinese painting and Tibetan painting, sort of added that into the mix. And so this is a work very similar to the one in the show. This is called Bird Blast. It's a collection of MoMA. This work, again, was where a systems-based work where I put it on a Lazy Susan, hooked, I don't know, like 8 birds with their forked tails together in the center, and then moved out from the center, basically trying to fill every possible square inch of it. And there's leaves, pills, and birds that radiate out to the center. And let me see if there's a detail of it. And this isn't the first time I use birds in my work, but it's really where birds are really starting to like get a real grip on me. So maybe I should talk about birds, since that's probably why I'm here and why many of you are here. For me, despite my inclinations to love nature, birds always seem rather remote to me. They maybe like dirt in the sky. Occasionally a big hawk would come by, and I go, oh, a hawk. But they always just seemed a little bit too far out of my perceptual apparatus to really get a grip on. So after a show I had done in Santa Monica, and I think it was 1992, I was with my brother, and we decided to go camping in Devil's Punch Bowl, the deepest fissure in the San Andreas Fault, just outside of Los Angeles in the Mojave Desert. And he had, at that point, he had been living in Yosemite, and he'd become a big birder. And he was like, oh, this is really great. If we go up to the incense cedar forest south from here, we'll be able to see western tanagers and pileated woodpeckers. So I was like, well, that's, and he showed me pictures in the book, and I was like, well, those look really amazing. I've never seen anything like that. And he goes, oh, it's easy. Here's a pair of binoculars, let's, when we're out hiking around, keep an eye out for them. And so I was out with him, and I had the binoculars, and I see this thing, and I looked up at it. I go, pileated woodpecker. And, and then about 20 minutes later, I was like, western tanager. And, I couldn't believe how this parallel reality that I'd lived in all my life was finally available to me through enhanced optics and a little bit of knowledge. And it kind of blew my mind. And it kind of related to, I thought, to kind of what I had been doing as an artist. This idea of, getting people to see things and to think about things that were sort of out there already, And that really kind of like not only did birds start entering into my work in a really big way, but I also became like, I'm not a great birder or anything like that, but I get on, I'm going to go to McGee Marsh tomorrow, and bird, and I'm super excited about it. And I've been in Central Park this week, where I live, birding, and so it's this little thing that keeps me from making art in my studio, but whatever. So anyway, there's these things. So when I made Bird Blast, I had all these voids cut out for my field guides that I was desecrating. So I started, coming from a working class immigrant family, oldest of 6 kids, I'm super frugal, and so had all these voids, and I was getting these catalogs in from Patagonia and Land's End, and I started playing around with the anatomical structure of birds and sort of putting these little outer Gore-Tex outerwear, polar fleece outerwear, zippered outfits on the birds. And I think from across the room, like a lot of my work, it looks like one thing, you get up close and it becomes something else. I really like that double take. I really like setting up perceptions that are then sort of gently crumbled once one examines it a little further. But I also thought it was a little funny that, like I was conflating these two ways that people get to know nature, like in your petrochemically based outerwear, running around, naming things with your books, and I also maybe asked the question of what happened to the environment that birds have to wear these outfits. So, I just thought they were sort of funny. So, anyway, growing up in the 70s and, basically I watched modernism fall apart and die and turn into postmodernist stasis, and it created a real crisis of faith for me and people in my generation. And I think, a lot of us in the 70s were sort of, after the last modernists, we were sort of like walking through the rubble of all these isms, trying to figure out what was worth saving, and sort of picking through the debris of all this sort of like cultural tumult. And I started, like just sort of picking up pieces that I thought still had value, things that I thought were still resonant, and maybe this is a work that sort of more or less addresses it. It's called New Jerusalem. And what it is it's a nice, I think pretty looking, sort of Victorian type framing device for this, what looks like a peaceful little town. But what I'd done is gone to the New York Public Library and researched, separatist communities in American history that were either religious or political. So I have the Unabomber cabin, the Drop City Commune, Mormon pluralist houses, the Aryan Nations compound, Shaker meeting houses, Charlie Manson's hideout at Barker Ranch. I mean, basically, this is not a pretty happy little town. This is a town of hate and suspicion. And I sort of thought that like maybe the history of America was the history of the imposition of ideology onto nature. We came here as Europeans to create a new Jerusalem, a city on the hill, and a kind of a new Eden, basically, away from the strictures of Europe. But in the process, of course, there was slavery and Native American genocide. So there was this ideology that had always permeated the landscape, and I was also thinking that very much was. This idea of the ideology permeating art world and the art, art history was also really interesting to me. All those isms that fell and all those isms that had been co-opted, like the Italian futurists, say, becoming fascists, or say like Malevich becoming a lackey for Stalin in his later years and painting, to me, this idea of this sort of co-option and eventual destruction of idealist ideology seemed to be part and parcel of what I had inherited. And so I was kind of come to grips with that, both sociologically and from the point of view of an artist. And I sort of felt like that the politics in my work, I thought were the kind of politics that my work that art could handle. It always had to come back to art. I always had to find a way that the social led back through art history, through my own personal experience, and back into the panels that I was making. So, I also would like to say, I need to make a couple of disclaimers here. You don't have to believe anything I'm saying. You can just look at the work and just go, you can say you hate it, but let's say you don't. Let's say you like it. Let's say you even love it. You can like it just visually, formally, and not even care about anything I said today. That's fine. I'm not your cop. You can do whatever you want. I do feel, though, that if like a song, if you are, seduced formally by the work and you want to like get in and listen to the lyrics, there's that, and maybe you can get more out of it. But that's totally up to you. The other thing I'd like to say is, you're looking at pictures of art, you're not looking at art, and what's really great is that there's actual real art that you can see here that has real dimensionality and scale and surface quality that doesn't come across in the photos. So for any of you who are here, I would encourage you to see the work in person, because it's way better than this stuff that I'm showing you. I'm going to skip over this one because, I don't know how that got switched over, but whatever. Some years ago, I started doing a lot of figurative work where I was making these composites figures that were sort of very much related to the work of Yusjepi Archimboldo and Tibetan Thangkas. And I was dealing with ideas about death and mortality. There had been some health scares, my kids growing up getting really strong, being a track guy and everything, and so I started making these works. This is a work called Breathing Head. Let me see. This is a work called Field Guides. This guy some people think he's being anointed by the butterflies. I think he's being attacked by them. I worked on a ranch. I know how hard agrarian labor is. And this is a picture that my kid helped me make. This is all the toys in our house, all those outgassing toys made in China. He just went through catalogs with me and picked out stuff that I should put in the piece. And that was how our house looked like for a long time before he discovered the computer. This is called Expecting to Fly, sort of about my punk rock past and Neil Young all conflated together. It's about the sublime, about leaping off the cliff, So there you go. This is a piece called, I'm going to have to go like fast here because this is a piece called Airborne Event. And it started out as an abstraction, but then it turned into, I was reading Don DeLillo's White Noise, and I started thinking about toxic airborne events, and the alien space abduction and the assumption of Virgin Mary into heaven. Next thing I know, I was making this figure, and boom, So, okay, here's some pictures. What happened here was that I started using birds as surrogates for human behavior. So this is where the birds really start kicking in this, by utilizing this sort of cobbled together Archimboldo little bits of things, like almost from a cellular level, making bigger things. I started doing that with birds. So this one's called Hummingbird, believe it or not. This is called, I don't forget what it's called, but it was based on me actually watching a red-tailed hawk pull a snake out of the grass and eat it, which freaked everybody out. It looked like the Mexican flag for a minute. And, but it's like, snakes made out of hundreds of snakes. This is a larger work. Migrant fruit thugs, there's a tapestry of that work in the show right now based on seeing two red-breasted grosbeaks come into my backyard, eat my figs, and I was like, oh, I hate birds eating my plants. And then I went, saw that they were these beautiful birds, so I let them eat all the figs they wanted. Blue geode. This is a work I did where I rubbed my eyes to get the phosphenes together, and then I tried to draw them really quick before they faded away. And then I did a whole bunch of work related to the New York Times, which is that's what I've been working on now lately. I'll just quickly flick through these for you, but I just wanted, what's been really, this is my first one, the first piece I did, but this idea of the hive mind of the newspaper, of editors, fact checkers, writers, photographers, all coming together to create the news that's supposedly fit to print. For me, it's a complicated matter about reality and perception because there really is a spotlight where the media chooses to see certain things and chooses to ignore certain things. And I became a little apoplectic in the run-up during the Iraq War, to tell you the truth. And I thought the Times was doing a terrible job, but it's my favorite paper. So I had all these conflicts. So I started drawing on the paper, and well, so this piece here, for instance, came out of this, which was a piece I made in 2000 called Untitled Expulsion. It was based on Masaccio's expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, which is the basic mythology that we have our utopianist belief system kind of based on in Western culture. And I thought that this Bernie Ebbers and his wife, being indicted in the WorldCom scandal was a very similar kind. They reminded me of Adam and Eve, clutching each other's hands. This idea of shame, was really interesting to me because here you have Eve is like covering her privates, and Adam is, oh my God, what have we done? And the whole idea of the perp walk, and then that just led to a whole bunch of stuff. And so I'll just quickly run through where I just tried to respond to the conditions of the photograph and the surrounding context of the news. And so that was like the New Orleans waterline, a city I really love. This guy reminded me of a snake handling crazy man. And let's just sort of flip through here where I just get to riff, and what's great about this is I get to kind of riff fast. My work takes 3, 4, sometimes 6 months to make one piece. So these are things that I can just really plow through. Here's one where I wanted to sort of gently humiliate Actiminijad by covering them with feminine flowers. And then I used my piece from the Whitney because I saw these catenaries of the martyrs of the revolution, and another jerk. And, another jerk. And, some of them are just purely formal, just trying to find something beautiful and all of that. And I sort of feel like these works are slightly related to the constellation drawings of Miro that he did during World War II. They're the most cosmic, beautiful, sublime things really created out of modernism, in my opinion, yet they were done at the height of one of the world's most horrific wars. And I almost feel like that their quiet politics is that the world's going to hell, but there's still something, it's still worth painting, it's still worth making art. Culture is still important. There's a reason why we reproduce and eat and try to live, and that's because of human culture. And so I sort of feel like that, hopefully there's something hopeful going on amid all this calamity. Here's an act of God in the form of an earthquake and becoming a visitation from the heavens, or alien space abduction again. Could be Cines halos from Renaissance, pre-Renaissance paintings, or maybe beach balls from a Fish concert. That guy. So, stained glass windows. So anyway, I've done like literally over, a lot, hundreds. I've made a book, making them big now. So that's what's been taking up my time. But after that, I still started making some stuff. This is a piece, you know what? I'm just going to pass it. I'm sorry. There's just not enough time. But I want to say that the sort of calamity of the world started entering into this New York Times started entering into my work in a bigger way. So this is a piece called Car Bomb. This is Burning Tower of Peace Towers. I was asked by DeSuvero and Ritt to participate in the Peace Tower project at the Whitney Museum some years back for the biennial. And I was like, how many? It was a revisiting of DeSuvero's Peace Tower from the late 60s. And I said, well, there must be, how many peace towers have there been? And it turns out there have been hundreds of peace towers, peace pagodas, peace temples, peace churches, peace monuments. So I downloaded them all off the internet, made a giant peace tower, and lit it on fire. So this is a piece, and more or less like I made it the whole time I was listening to Katrina drowning New Orleans, and this is sort of like this big tornado, cherubs, heavenly cherubs, jellyfish, you know, so that was called Abductor, and Raven, and then I did my retrospective, and then I started seeing how it started in minimalist abstraction, ended up in narrative work, and then to try to combine them together, and I started making these big bird's eyes made out of other bird's eyes, going back into abstraction. And I think I'm going to end with this piece. This is a piece called Night Music for Raptors, and it's actually, it could be an owl, but it's made out of thousands of bird's eyes. But I was thinking, there are also the two circles that come together are the same exact size as two LPs. So I was thinking about them as two turntables. And I was sort of thinking about this idea of the sounds at night. And I was sort of thinking about, whoa, sorry about that. I wasn't going to, I'm not going to show you that piece. Forget you saw that. And sort of started thinking about like the stars at night. And so it kind of brought me full circle back to this idea of abstraction and representation existing in the same space, this idea of sound and this idea of culture. So anyway, thank you for coming to my talk. I think that's it.
If you don't mind, we're going to answer a couple of questions.
Oh, there you go.
All right.
Oh, you're
we're
on.
up live. So come on up to the microphone, and we'll take a couple of questions. So we have one person
If
here.
you want to shout them out, I can repeat the question back to the audience if I can hear it.
I was kind of curious. Tomaselli is an Italian name, I'm presuming, and I wonder how your Italian heritage is reflected in your artwork and your view of the world.
Well, you know, I as I was saying earlier, my father actually is an immigrant from Italy, from the north of Italy, and he's still alive, lives in California, became a U.S. citizen. Italian is his first language. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. He was a member of the Knights of Columbus, and I was an altar boy. And, you know, as I was talking earlier, I had, you know, I both referenced Giuseppe Arcimboldo and Masaccio, two great Renaissance Italian painters in my work. But I think the bigger influences in my work is probably related to the notion of reliquary. You know, these real objects have a kind of symbolic importance, much like the objects I use in my work, much like the bones of the saints or maybe a piece of the true cross. And it's my belief that conceptualism starts with reliquaries in the Catholic Church, because these objects that might be banal in any other circumstance become extra charged when given a backstory, when told that they have extra meaning, you know, and then they become venerated objects, you know. So for me, this notion of the reliquary has been deeply important to my work. I should say that, like, for many years, I encased all my work under resin, all of it, including the paint. And I realized I was missing the reliquary of the human touch on the surface of the work, and that I wanted to bring that back into my work. So the most recent work, which you'll see here in the show, there's like 3 works, have the paint directly on the surface, right on the surface, keeping my hand there, and extending this notion of the reliquary a little bit further.
Any other questions? All right. Well, we invite everyone to come upstairs.
Thank you for that question, by the way.
We invite everyone to come on upstairs to Libby Court for the book signing. And at this point, if you don't mind joining me in thanking Fred Tomaselli for his lecture and for joining us here in Toledo.
Thank you.